So I am delighted to welcome first here to the session Nadine and Nadia Deller. It is my first time meeting them in person today, seeing face together with their voice. I am a huge fan of their That Black Theatre podcast, which you'll hear them speak about today in addition to their wider work. Nadine is a PhD researcher undertaking a collaborative doctoral award between the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama and the National Theatre. The aim of her research is to shed light on the different positions of Black women playwrights in the Black Plays Archive and to critique the way that the Black Plays Archive preserves Black women's theatre, which is still often submerged. In September 2020, Nadine and her sister Nadia released a podcast on Black theatre history, That Black Theatre Podcast, in collaboration with the National Theatre, CSSD, and LHP. Nadine also writes for the international film magazine Sight and Sound. Nadia is Nadine's younger sister and co-host of That Black Theatre Podcast. She works in clinical trials, specializing in patient recruitment. As co-host of the podcast, Nadia focuses on the accessibility of Black stories through theatre and how that history is so relevant to today. You're both very welcome. We can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Hello, everyone.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. That was such a great introduction. So I think I'll kick things off. And I'm Nadine, as Charlotte has said, and me and Nadia are going to be speaking with you today about the Black Plays Archive and That Black Theatre Podcast, a podcast we created about Black theatre history in Britain. I'm going to talk to you about the Black Plays Archive before Nadia jumps into the podcast. But before I do that, I want to pose a question for you in relation to education and knowledge to think about, which we'll come to later. So how does information grow? That's a question that's posed by César Hidalgo, an associate professor at MIT, which may not seem immediately relevant to rethinking the British theatre canon and the curriculum, but let me explain and it will become a bit clearer. And to do that, I will tell you about the Black Plays Archive. So the Black Plays Archive, or BPA, is an online archival project. It's run by the National Theatre, and it was initiated in 2009 by Kwame Kwei-Armah, the artistic director of the Young Vic, and it seeks to really address the underrepresentation of Black theatre histories by documenting the first professional production of every play by Black, British, African and Caribbean writers in the UK. The project is one which I consider has the potential to educate the public through Blackness, demonstrating what Rosanne Chantelouque calls an antidote to a mainstream education system that promotes whiteness at every level of its function. It does this partly through a website, an archival website, which is also a catalogue, kind of like a library, that directs users to physical archive materials on Black plays in Britain where available. My current data shows that there are 587 plays since 1909, although this number must be constantly added to as the data grows and we find more plays. So the BPA initiative, I see it anyway, as a contribution to the significant work already being done and has been being worked on in recognising a Black British theatre canon. But it's also important because one historical problem with archiving is that Black practitioners and global majority practitioners have often had to archive and curate the work themselves, and it's been left out of institutions. As a living archive, which is open to reinterpretation and constantly growing, the BPA can be used to reread, I feel, our British theatre canon, where Black contribution, as I kind of said, has been erased, omitted and pushed to the margins, often by what Mina Salami coins as Europatrial knowledge production. In creating a predominantly digital archival space then, there is not only the potential for the BPA to address the gaps in how Black British theatre history is recorded and taught, but also to address the digital divide in access to knowledge and education, what Alondra Nelson defines as the gaps in technological access that fall along the lines of race, region and ability, and which have come into even sharper focus since the start of the coronavirus pandemic, as we've seen. So making the BPA available digitally means that it's far more accessible than if it were restricted to those in academic institutions only or in central London, for example. But if the BPA is an important archival project, which I sincerely believe it is, then why didn't I hear about it until after I finished my master's degree? This brings me back to the question that I posed at the beginning. How does information grow? One key problem with the knowledge transmission of any kind of data, and particularly cultural memory, is that it doesn't survive because it was embodied on one physical device that doesn't last very long. Take the works of Shakespeare, for example. As Hidalgo says, information survives as long as it reproduces. So for me, a question was, if Black theatre has not been well documented until fairly recently, the barriers for it to grow and reproduce and then be taught are greater. And if most of the archival material we have access to is text which, by the way, is really difficult to get hold of if you're from a low socioeconomic background, if you're marginalised, if you aren't in the academy, then how do we reproduce this knowledge and transmit it to as many people as we can? After looking through the archive, I found documents about producing a podcast, potentially, and a podcast to me seemed as a potential solution to the question I had about knowledge and how we can make it grow. If we could produce a podcast that was told by and for Black communities and voices, and we could reach beyond the confines of the academy or theatre, which is often kind of elite, the project could demonstrate a form of education which Santaluca refers to as an education of living politics, an educational platform that comes from the people and stays with the people, a transformative act of education and resistance to colonial pedagogical norms. Part of making it accessible and transformative to me was bringing people who aren't part of the academy, and that's when Nadia became involved. So I'll hand over to Nadia to tell you about the podcast itself.
Thanks, Nadine. Hi, everyone. So as you already know, my name is Nadia and I co-host that Black Theatre podcast. I'm going to talk to you about the podcast and my perspective of why it's so important. So the podcast looks at Black theatre, past, present and future, tracing the socio-political and cultural changes in Britain's Black communities and the stories they have told in theatre. Each week we discuss a different play from a different point in time, from incredible writers like Mustafa Matura, Winston Pinnock, Ola Ince, just to name a few. We begin in the 1930s, challenging notions that Black history began in the post-war years by looking at Una Marsden, the first Black woman to work as a broadcaster for the BBC and a brilliant playwright. From there, we discuss colonial legacies and migration stories from Barry Record and Errol John in the 1950s. And as we pass through history of the 20th century, we highlight the godmother of Black British theatre, Winston Pinnock, and look at the underrepresentation of Black women and Black queer voices. We also discuss themes relating to plays, including the Windrush generation, the Black Lives Matter movement, and assess just how far we've come in Black theatre that we see on stage today. We began the podcast back in September of 2020, and as we all know, it was a crazy year, but it was a year that we had hoped a lot of people's eyes were opened with the resurgence of Black Lives Matter. 2020 began a lot of conversations for a lot of families, including my own. I began to think more about the lack of representation for Black people and how unwelcome that I felt in predominantly white spaces, including theatre. So when Nadine posed the idea of the podcast, it became something that I felt and still feel very passionately about, because what I didn't see growing up, I want to be available for the next generation. See, I truly believe that if you see something, you can do it. And it was interesting to me that when Nadine approached me about the podcast, it didn't occur to her that that was something that she could do. It didn't occur to her that she could be the one creating and hosting it. And she said to me, I think somebody needs to make a podcast of Black theatre history. And I said, so why don't you do it? You do that. You can do that. And it's so often that we see that. We so often see Black women and women of colour, they don't see themselves shaping spaces or narratives or representation, and they feel that we aren't entitled to. So choosing to produce and write this podcast in itself is an act of rebellion and empowerment to show that we really are limitless. I hope that this podcast can be more than just an educational tool, but a source of positivity and brilliance, and just show the resilience that Black people have overcome. I want it to be an audible library for people to hear these incredible stories, these sometimes emotional stories. The podcast is something that I think is really important for rethinking and reframing the curriculum. I say this as somebody who grew up Black mixed on a council estate, which was the birthplace of the BNP. There were many running home from schools. It was a very difficult time. So I knew that was something that was somewhere that I could not belong. But that's also something that I feel quite similarly. When I step into a theatre, I get that same feeling of imposter syndrome. It's a space that I feel cripplingly unwelcome for somebody who looks like me and is not an academic. But that is why this podcast is so important. That is why we need it so much. So that people just like me can feel like this is a space for them, to know that people who look like them aren't just on stage, but behind the scenes creating the stories. We hope to enlighten those who listen and reinforce the fact that there is no one way to be Black. We're about to play you a clip from one of the episodes with Mojisola Adebayo, whose play Mudge of the Antarctic retells the incredible story of Ellen Craft, who is the definition of a trailblazer. I can tell you that if I had been taken on a school trip or been given a script to read about Ellen Craft, instead of constant depictions of stories that I cannot relate with, resonate with, or with people who don't look like me, I know I would be far more engaged with theatre and perhaps wouldn't feel like it's a space where if you are not elite, you do not belong and you are not included. So here's a clip from Mojisola where they talk about their play and what inspired it.
Thanks, Nadia. So I'm going to share a clip from our podcast with you. So I hope you enjoy.
But what inspired me to write Mudge of the Antarctic was years ago on my MA doing research into the way I was really fascinated with the ways that people in the African diaspora have used performance skills in everyday life, and particularly performance skills for liberation, performance skills to overcome oppression, performance skills within slavery, performance skills within colonialism, sort of not on stage, but it would definitely be performance skills. So yeah, I was kind of fascinated by that. And my example was Muhammad Ali, because Muhammad Ali rapped at press conferences, gave poetry in interviews, danced jazzed the shuffle in the boxing ring, and was very much performed himself, and those were skills, and also did magic tricks and all kinds of stuff, did levitation, and used performance skills as a way to say, I'm not going to be what you want me to be, I'm free to be who I want. I can perform, I can play, I can be whatever. And he was extraordinary in that. And so I was really fascinated with Ali, and my research was on Ali, but then in the process of looking at the ways in which Black people have used performance skills, I came across the story of Ellen Craft. And Ellen Craft was a mid-19th century African-American enslaved woman who cross-dressed as a white man to escape slavery. And she did it, and she got away with it with her husband, William Craft, and she managed to convince people that she was a white man. And I was so taken with this idea, partly because I'm an actor, and the idea that you can do such an incredibly convincing performance, and the consequence of the performance not being good enough for Ellen Craft was possible death, abuse, rape, re-enslavement, separation from her loved ones, separation from her husband. So just an extraordinary performance, but also the ways in which that life demonstrates a kind of crossing and of boundaries, a crossing and melting of the idea of identities, of fixed identities. So she's crossing geographical boundaries from the deep south to the north. She's crossing gender boundaries. She's crossing racial boundaries. And I extended that story, inspired by her, and extended the story where the central character based on her, called Mudge, becomes a sailor on board a whaling ship bound for Antarctica. So escapes from the deep south up to the northern states, comes over to England as Ellen Craft did. But where my story diverges is that she gets a job as a sailor on a whaling ship and goes to Antarctica. So I wanted to look at the kind of melting of identities, and through that look at melting ice and the consequence of melting ice and rising sea levels on Africa, and somehow to connect Africa and Antarctica through this character. So it's a pretty expansive, epic story, but she is who inspired me.
Yeah, it is a really epic story, and I think I'd never read anything like that before. And when I found out about Ellen Craft and that story, it blew my mind. It properly blew my mind. I was like, how did she do that? And how have I not heard that story before? And of course, yeah, and so I don't know, when you decided to turn that into a performance, because it feels like a really brave story to choose to tell, because it's kind of really out there, I would say, in so many different ways, with all of the different kind of transgressive things that are happening in that play. Did you feel like it was something? Did you feel like you were doing something really brave? Did it feel like it was something that was out there when you decided to do it?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of you to say, but Ellen Craft is the brave one. I'm just an actor, you know. Like, I'm just an actor and a writer. That was brave. That was brave, to put on men's clothes, to take and re-sew men's clothes, to dress in men's clothes in 1848 or whenever it was, to escape with her husband, dark-skinned black man. And the reason why she was escaping as a man and not playing a woman was that they wanted to go together. It was a love story, really, and they knew that if a dark-skinned black man was traveling with somebody who was passing as a white woman, there's no way anybody would believe that relationship. So then she decides to pass as a white man, and her husband, William Craft, plays her slave, her servant. I mean, his performance is also amazing. That deserves another play, you know. He's having to serve his wife as if she was his master, male, you know, like, it's just amazing. So she's the brave one, risking her life, her body, her relationship, everything, both of them, for freedom, having to, you know, I reminded my teacher, Auguste Boal, was said that, you know, she talked about the courage to be happy.
Thank you so much for listening to us, everybody. And if you want to listen to the podcast in its full series and the incredible people that we interview, it's available on all streaming platforms. So go and take a listen.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Nadine and Nadia. And already I'm wishing we could just stop and touch and talk on so many things. And I love the phrase that you used to open your presentation, how does information grow? And as I was fumbling for how to pithily talk about what brings these four panelists together today, I think that that's a really nice metaphorical way to think about it. You know, all of you as activists, as scholars, as artists have said, how do we take the work that we're doing, voices, use the medium of our alternative channels to get to broader audiences so that information can grow. So we'll come back to that, but just to say that here. So next up on our panel today is Dr. Ann Folino White, who is Associate Professor of Theater Studies at Michigan State University. Her history of Depression-era food rights performances titled Plowed Under, Food Policy Protests and Performances in New Deal America received the 2015 C.L.R. James Book Award from the Working Class Studies Association. She is editor of Theater Annual, a journal of theater and performance of the Americas. She is also author of the play The Lady Victory, an adaptation of Jane Vincent Taylor's autobiographic poetry collection about girls in a maternity home for unwed mothers in 1960s Oklahoma. And as I said to Anne in the pre-talk before the panel, a lot of interesting histories there between that history and the history of mother and baby homes, Magdalen laundries, and so on in Ireland. And select directing credits for MSU include The Grapes of Wrath, In the Blood, the Scottish play Macbeth, still superstitious, sorry, and most recently Bonnets, How Ladies of Good Breeding Are Induced to Murder by Jen Silverman. Bonnets was commissioned by the Big Ten Consortium through its initiative for new plays by and about women. The production was unfortunately canceled 2 days prior to opening night due to COVID-19. And we'll be touching on that project today, but hopefully we'll get to talk about that broader context of her work and research as well. You're very welcome, Anne.
Hi, thank you, Charlotte. I'm going to awkwardly now share my screen with everybody just so you can, let's see, share screen. Maybe I can't. Oh my gosh, share screen. This is what I want to do. Okay, so today I am going to, I am an academic, I'm a historian, as Charlotte mentioned, but I'm going to talk today from my position as an artist, collaborator, and an educator of artists. And so I'm going to talk primarily about my role in the Big Ten Theatre Consortium. And if you can see, the Big Ten Consortium is comprised of 14 different universities. And this was really the brainchild of one of the heads of the theater programs at these universities by the name of Alan McVeigh, who is at he's retired now, but he was at the University of Iowa. And the heads of these departments saw a need to, well, they saw an ongoing issue of departments producing canonical plays that neither had roles for women, nor were these plays by women. So meanwhile, we are predominated in our departments by female students. And so in thinking about that question that Nadine posed right at the beginning, how does knowledge get produced, right, and shared? This project was a really low-cost way for these universities to start to open up opportunities, open up the canon, and sort of shake it from its hold on educational theater. Each university, there was total buy-in. They all contributed a very small amount of money for university theater budgets, which was around $1,000 to $1,100 US. The bulk of that went to the commission for the playwright. And the requirements really, when a playwright was commissioned, was that the play had to have a minimum of 6 substantial, which is important, substantial roles for college-age women, as well as participate in the productions by working with the students, perhaps having a residency and whatnot. So the first opportunity to present a play really came in 2013, 2014, even though the university started working together as a team in 2010. And that play was by Naomi Iizuka, called Good Kids, regarding sexual assault at the high school level. So in the past 7 to 8-ish years, there have been 5 plays written, 23 productions by these universities, and or stage readings. But within these 5 plays, Good Kids by Naomi Iizuka has, since its publication, had more than 118 productions. So as we think about how knowledge gets produced and how those tectonic plates shift, when a play is written and produced, and producing a play begets publication of a play, begets more productions of a play, this has had a slow but sure ripple effect in the past 6 years. Also, Baltimore by Kristen Greenidge has had 34 productions beyond those of the initial Big Ten university productions. So, and these are primarily at other US institutions. However, there have been a number of professional productions. So I like to think of how this small cooperative project, which just required a little willingness, really has started to move things from university stages out into the greater public as it moves across university stages. In my role as the director of Bonnets, which was sadly canceled. There we go. I'm going to switch the slide. You can see images at the top of this slide from the production that I directed, and then images from 3 other productions produced by these Big Ten universities. So in my role as the director, I really want to talk about the way in which bonnets allowed us to change the everyday operational dynamics of theater departments that come about because we're so tied to the canon. I think it was Nadia was mentioning the lack of feeling a space and a home for her. And I often find as a feminist director that myself and my students are trying to, with the production of canonical plays, fit ourselves right into, like, retrofit these plays that we're holding onto in this historical baggage. And by embracing this play, what we were able to do was to create a feminist dominated space. And that happened not just because the production team was predominantly female design and female management, but also because of the representations afforded to us by the playwright. These were complex characters. It was an ensemble, right? So the hierarchy of role was dispensed with. Also, the portrayals of women were not these sort of two-dimensional, in-service, heteronormative, patriarchal portrayals that, you know, with gender bending, which I am all for, and cross-gender casting, it's oftentimes a band can be a band-aid solution and a push and a fit and a revision and all of that kind of stuff. But Jen Silverman's roles allowed us just to get to work, and also allowed us to divorce those embodied types from character, so that we could have a diverse casting in ways that the female artists could, and female identifying artists could, break free from the commercial typing of the theater and train themselves beyond train themselves to play. So those were some of the ways. Another sort of anecdotal way that it changed conditions was that when I auditioned the cast, when I was auditioning students, I had some of my male students, my cisgender male students, say, well, can I audition anyway? Or Ann, why don't you work with men? Which is not true. I do all the time. I just wasn't. And with those questions, it spurred conversations about their expectations of what is deserved, bringing equity into the theater, their expectations on my labor, their bringing them into awareness of really where my time should be spent, right? And affording time and space for female identifying actors and designers. The other thing that I would like to say about this experience is that I had invited a course on theater criticism, wanted to attend, and that course was located in a different college, and so they came to a rehearsal and it was lovely, and they watched and sort of understood how rehearsal operated. And following that event, I received an email from a student who expressed that not only had she never seen women who were fat and both white and Black play roles in which they were passionate and romantic interests. And so that really impressed upon her that she could see her identity reflected. But it wasn't just that. It was that in watching that rehearsal process, she felt like she had a home among women, or could see women operating in a space conducive to the complexity of and diversity of womanhood. And she expressed, I've never seen two women act with so much confidence, as in behave with so much confidence. So that was another outcome that had shifted things. I think the last thing that I would say about those everyday operations that this project allowed us to really embrace was that there were multiple generations of women working on this project. And this is true in terms of the design and the casting, and me and the production team. And so what we were allowed to do was have those conversations across generations, across the intersections of our intersectional identities, be they race, age, ability, body, sexuality. And so that really allowed us to build an environment, build a production, build working conditions that were feminist. And I suppose the very last thing I will say, I'm not sure where I am on time, is that all of this then circulated back into the curriculum, because our production season here is not just a thing unto itself, as it may be in the professional theater, but it brings in through the curriculum students from general education classes. Most of they may be studying to be engineers or mathematics or all different professions that they are looking toward. And most of them in the US don't have experience and access with theater because, like Nadia was expressing, it really is thought of as for a specific group of people. And economically, in fact, it often is. But these students don't have much experience with theater. And plays like Bonnets, because of this initiative, are included on syllabi in general education, and that provides students who've never seen a play to learn to read one, learn that it, make an impression on them that I want to almost say like a blank slate that is somehow introducing them to theater in this way, alleviates some of the weight of the baggage of the canon. And that's what I have for everybody. I'm excited to hear more questions and have more conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ann. And I immediately started coughing as soon as you started finishing. So I just want to pick up on two things there, connecting back to Nadine and Nadia. One, we're talking here about the structural. We're talking about also this idea of when do we let people into a process or address people as a potential member of an audience or a community. I find that anecdote of the rehearsal room really moving and really instructive as well, about who do we assume wants to see or not see within a process and what is the effect it can have. And I also want to come back eventually to that, the conversations with the white male cisgender students, and this idea that you're beginning a conversation that doesn't lead to a consensus, but is itself part of a process. And that's something I think as well that within That Black Theater podcast is animated again and again by Nadine and Nadia in conversation with each other, with their interviewees, and the synergies are quite clear to me there. So thank you so much. Last but certainly not least, we have Ciara O'Dowd, who studied English and drama and English literature at Trinity College Dublin and Glasgow University before gaining a first-class honor master's in writing from NUI Galway. She was a College of Arts doctoral scholar at NUI Galway, where she wrote her doctoral thesis on the on and off stage roles of Irish actresses of the Abbey Theatre in the 1930s. And one of the things that she pioneered within this thesis was looking at the craft and the art of biographical writing about these women alongside the theater historical study of their lives, and also along the way has also done a number of creative writing projects around the lives of these actresses. She also developed and taught the first ever module on the Abbey Theatre Archive at NUI Galway, and was a research assistant on the Druid Theatre Archive project, which involved taking oral histories. Her writing on Irish theatre past and present has been published in New Hibernia Review, IATC Journal Critical Stages, and Theatre Topics, a great article there on digital archives and feminist history for you to check out. as well as the literary magazine Banshee. She was an associate researcher for Waking the Feminists. And for those of you who are regularly attending our series, you will have heard from Lee and Bell last week, and a co-researcher indeed with our own Ciara Murray here, and an author as well as Ciara and others of Gender Counts, an analysis of gender in Irish theatre, 2006 to 2015. In 2016, she received the HD Fellowship in English Literature from Yale University to further her research on Ria Mooney. She has been an independent assessor for the Arts Council since 2012, and in July 2020 became theatre advisor to the Arts Council of Ireland. Ciara, you're very welcome.
Lovely to, sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah, lovely to see you all and be here today. I suppose I'm just going to speak kind of generally around my work and how I got here, or maybe, and I'm going to try and just share a few slides with you if I can do that. Can you see that? Sarah, you might give me a thumbs up if that's visible to everybody. Just, I suppose, to introduce myself and talk about where I came from. As Charlotte said, I came to NUIG as a student on the Masters in Writing, and I have been thinking recently about everything that has been going on in the last year, and I took over as the advisor to the Arts Council in July of last year, in the middle of a pandemic, amongst everything else. And among the chaos and everything on every level that's been going on this year, I keep coming back to this quote from Anne Bogart, which is talking about remembering all the time what we value in our lives, and that how that engages us and allows things to happen and allows movement. Because there's so much going on at the moment that it feels that I need to reassert to myself the importance that I have put on the arts throughout my life. And I suppose particularly on theatre and on the form and the potential of theatre and everything that it can do. Its ability to transform, to include, to explain, and to allow us to express things that can't be expressed elsewhere. And I think it's really important that we remember that. There's so much going on at the moment that I suppose for me just needs to be reasserted all the time. As Charlotte said, I came to NUIG to study writing, and I wandered into the archives one day and found an archive from this lady here, who is the actress Aideen O'Connor, and her papers were in the archive as a result of her husband, really, Arthur Shields, who was an actor in the Abbey Company. And as part of that collection, Aideen's letters and diaries from her time as a young actress in the Abbey in the 30s and her subsequent travels were included there. And I became fascinated by her, but not, I always want to say, not at the beginning as a feminist. It was never a feminist project. It was never a political project. My interest in it was biographical, and to start looking at the way we tell life stories. Aideen's life didn't have a traditional happy ending in any kind of a way, and I somehow wanted to celebrate the life that she'd had and what she'd been through. And that project started to expand quite quickly. Before I was even on a PhD program, I just decided to go and follow her footsteps, and I went to LA. Just show you, sorry, some silly photos, but this was the apartment block that she lived in the 1920s. And when I got there, I started to blog about what I was doing, primarily at the time, really to let my family know that I was there and I was safe. But I also found something in the structure of a blog that I think now, for me anyway, listening to podcasts has a similar shape and structure, which I think goes some way towards answering Nadine's point about how information grows, because I think blogs and podcasts allow a structure with a trajectory that doesn't necessarily have a defined ending. And that is so useful at times because it allows us to set a direction and begin a process without necessarily knowing where it's going to take us, and accepting that along that way there will be detours and diversions, and there are bound to be mistakes and dead ends. And it's not about that. It's actually about how you deal with those, incorporate them into a messy, crazy trajectory, and find some way through it, back to what we believe in and what we value. This was Aidan O'Connor's daughter, Christine Shields, who came with me, incredibly adventurous woman, and was just brilliant in allowing me to follow her mother's story and to trace that. And it was her who really pushed me actually at that point to look at the other women around Aidan in the company at that time. And so my PhD kind of rapidly expanded into looking at 5 women from the same company. And what I found was that in one way, those 5 women represented case studies of Irish lives, in that none of them came from a similar background. They all had different socioeconomic backgrounds. They all had different training. They all had different influences on their lives. And that allowed me to look at a kind of a cross-section of Irish women of that time who were negotiating these incredibly difficult circumstances and political conditions, but didn't even necessarily see that or realize that. When I look back on my PhD now, I often think if I did a word check, the word that would come up more than anything else is negotiate, because that's what they did at every step of the way. And it wasn't about a political movement or a political push, but they were dealing day in, day out with these things and just trying to make the best of what they could, and also to continue to focus on their art and their belief in theatre and in the art form, and again what that allowed. And I've been struck in listening to that Black Theatre podcast, and also what Anne was saying there about this real desire we have for complexity and nuance in these stories, and in these studies, that it is not about ticking a box or counting the numbers in one way, although I will talk about that too, but it's about that there's a real need for complexity and nuance in these stories. I suppose went on, this is just from Yale, ended up in the Beinecke Library looking particularly at Ria Mooney, who is an Irish actress from the Abbey, but who worked with Eva Le Gallienne's company in New York. And Le Gallienne's papers are in the Beinecke, and I was lucky enough to be able to go and look at those papers and to find the traces of this Irish woman living in New York. And it was an incredible visit. But while I was there, I suppose one of the things I remember about that trip is that while I was there 5 hours behind everybody else, we were preparing the gender counts, or finalizing the research for Waking the Feminists at that time. And it's another project I know, I'm sure you talked about it last week, and people are aware of gender counts, but it was another project, I suppose, that was started as a very simple premise in one way, was that we just wanted to gather evidence. And our initial aims for the project were quite, like, we saw them as quite limited or humble in one way, I suppose, that we wanted to look at 10 companies and to see what that could tell us about the wider infrastructure. And it was a project that was done in truly feminist fashion. It was not, I think we all thought that such research projects, involved like a lovely salary where you could go into a nice office and lock yourself up for the day and work on it. That report was written in very early mornings, very late at night. Brenda Donoghue, who was the lead researcher on the project, had a small child, and I used to drive to Kildare because there was a play centre where her daughter could play while we discussed the report and the research and put it together. And in so many ways, that the success and the impact that that report has had was a shock to us at the time, I think simply because we had been so involved in the detail of it. We were so aware of the limits of what we were doing, and yet what it has, the impact that it has had on the sector has been massive. And it's now we're seeing the impact of that in the wider arts sector, which is really important. That work, I suppose, with the gender counts and Waking the Feminists in some strange way dovetailed into my position now with the Arts Council. And as I said, it's been incredibly challenging and frustrating the last 6 months, but I keep coming back to the things that we value and that we value about the art form. It feels in so many ways that we're in uncharted territory. I think in terms of the inclusion and diversity in the Irish arts, and also in terms of COVID. And I think, again, that we're all trying to find our way through it, and that my growing sense is that this is not going to be easy. It's not going to be straightforward. Unlike an academic, I think, a journal or a monograph where we have the answers, or we'll work out the answers and then just apply it. What is becoming more and more evident is that this process for everybody is going to be messy and complicated, but that doesn't devalue it. I think it's actually giving it more meaning, perhaps, and allowing us to find our way through. And I think I'd love to see that in the wider infrastructure in terms of theatre, is that creating more of a system that allows people to try things and fail, to have those difficult conversations, as Anne was saying, in a rehearsal room, and not necessarily to have the answers, but to know that the questions are there. There's a American philosopher whose name I'm not going to be able to remember now, but he uses the metaphor of being in a ship on stormy waters in the middle of the ocean. And if there's something wrong with the ship, you can't just decide to stop and rebuild it. That you have to in some way reconstruct it from where you are by taking out one bit and using that to shore up something else until we can continue. And you can in that way rebuild the whole ship, but it's a long process, and it requires very gentle balance and consideration. And I think it's a useful metaphor to hold on to, that we can be creative, we can be ambitious, but we're also going to need a certain amount of resilience. I think that's me, unless there's any specific questions.
That's brilliant, Ciara. And it brings up, I think, so much in terms of what we discussed so far and where we want to go. I suppose as chair, it falls to me to invite the other speakers to now turn back on your cameras, maybe remain on mute unless you're going to jump in to speak, but turn on the cameras. And to also, I think probably the honor or the fear of the first question falls to me. But as I formulate that, I'll say to all of you as well, I always like to invite panelists to ask questions of each other, actually, to start after I give whatever is my opening thought here. So you all are invited to come up with a question for one another. And now we're open to questions and comments here in the chat, which I'll relate back to the women. Just to pick up on your last metaphor there, Ciara, or your last kind of layered discussion, and it was so great to hear that journey of your own, which I know, but it's like hearing it anew again. I forgot about the blog, actually, but such an obvious connection here to what is going on. You talk about this idea of us being on a ship, the work, and the context I think that you're making reference to here are the ongoing struggles around gender and diversity within the Irish theatre sector, what is happening to our creative industries post-COVID-19, and by post, I mean within, and the dragging tail of it, I'm sure after. There are so many issues and questions to balance that we're not going to get right on the first try. So there's that. And I would say as well, I think something that I'm struck of in the work that you do and the work that Nadine and Nadia have done, what Ann has done in a US context and my own research, is that it's not, there often is an impression that we're starting out this difficult work for the first time, whereas in fact, there have been iterations or efforts over time where people have tried and failed. And sometimes those stories get lost to history, except through the work that many of you have done here. So I suppose my opening thought would then be within two strands. One, or I suppose to bring it together, it seems to me what's shared amongst the people on this panel is a mission around telling the complexity and the nuance of history in ways that reach the broadest audiences possible and that charge us to keep doing the work. I think I will throw open the awful question of kind of in this COVID moment, in terms of that shared ambition and work, what do you think are the possibilities? And what do you think are the blind spots or the traps in terms of particularly widening inequalities that you all are maybe thinking about in this moment of your work? So opportunities and what we can't miss out on as a trap within this moment in the mission that all four of you share in different ways.
I think one of the traps is things getting buried and hidden in the archive, and also the resilience, as Ciara has said, and the patience that it requires in order to, like, the numbers are in, we accomplished this much, now can we move on? No, it's a constant need for reiteration, and that kind of work it can be tiring just because of the, like, you wash the dishes and you see the result and it's great, right? But it's like this constant repetition that is required for progress. Yes, and the ability to not discount failed attempts. I think that's the other thing. And then I guess the last thing I would say to that is the willingness, the time, the patience, and the support to archive it, to document it, to create the record of history. I was reading a review regarding performance studies-based work, and it was a review by a historian saying her case is more convincing when she can produce the documents. And I wanted to shake them and say, the reason we can't produce the documents and the reason that performance studies approaches, theatrical approaches, podcast approaches matter is because the speculation, the questions raised, the sort of the known conspicuous absence of evidence is something that also must be documented. And so I think that's my thought. I don't know if it really went anywhere, but that's the trap and the hard work.
And it picks up on a point last week as well raised by Ciara Murphy about her work in the Dublin Fringe Festival archives, looking at the work of ensembles, of women, of minority artists, that, what is lost there. And I would say as well, we talk about failure and not being afraid of it, but it's also, I think, reappropriating the idea of failure. And Jack Halberstam's work on the queer art of failure there is really beautiful and instructive on this, because when we say failure, do we mean box office receipts, capitalist values, white supremacist values? Let's blow that up, right? Not literally, I'm not condoning that. I think Ciara is going to come in, and then if the other panelists, you can come in or not, or we can go to a question in the chat. So Ciara, go.
Yeah, no, I mean, just to echo, I think that's brilliant, Anne, on all of those traps, particularly. I think the opportunities potentially, strangely, on the COVID thing are perhaps a bit more time, or a bit more, because, well, for me anyway, I know time has just become this strange quality. It's a very different thing at the moment, and so in one way there is more time to focus. There's much more time to listen to podcasts, or definitely you see that with people, that those kind of things, and I think the online possibilities that are opening up are an opportunity. While we may hate it in lots of ways, I think that is happening. And I think particularly, well, just speaking for myself, I'm starting to feel old in that the things that I'm seeing young theatre artists do online, and those kind of connections that they've been able to forge and those forums they've been able to find are something that's really interesting and will really serve them. But like that, it is that space to fail, and I think, Charlotte, we've had this conversation before because it's kind of vital to me, but I think it is something that that is really important, that we find that space for things not to quite work out. I don't mean fail spectacularly, but often just to not quite work out, and then how people deal with those is the issue. Like, that's the interesting part for me always, is what happens when it fails, what happens next.
And often we've seen art, companies or artists penalized for that sometimes within the professional theatre sector in Ireland, and I'm sure
exactly.
elsewhere.
Yeah.
So that is also a conversation about all the structural inequalities, how does that play out, etc. Nadine and Nadia, anything burning to come in here, or not burning, smoldering?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of completely agree with everything you've just said. This idea of, I think, what Anne was talking about in terms of the documents aren't there because of the structural inequalities, because of problems where we have, when we were talking about why certain types of theatre or certain types of art, women's theatre, people of colour, it's submerged, or there are only fragments, there are traces, as Ciara was saying, because of the fact that they haven't been allowed to collate them, and also because we value text too much in a lot of ways. Ephemeral forms of transmission in all sorts of different cultures are really, really important, and I don't think that is taken seriously enough. And the other thing I wanted to say in terms of the possibilities, I was thinking about this the other day, and this idea of the digital space and the kind of problems that it shows us, in the sense that digital spaces aren't free like we like to imagine. There are power dynamics going on, but Marissa Parham talks about Black digitality, and the idea that we talk about the digital divide, we talk about the fact that there's intellectual poverty, and that it's harder for marginalised groups, racially marginalised groups, to access technology, but and that is often the prevailing narrative. But a lot of the time we don't talk about the fact that racially marginalised groups, that feminist groups, that queer groups have been using digital spaces for quite a while now in transgressive, subversive, interesting, expressive way. Black Lives Matter started as a hashtag. So I think, for me, whilst I totally agree that time and this idea that we need to constantly admit that we don't always get things right, and I know there's so much talk in the academy right now in terms of being aware of diversity, and it's kind of become more pronounced now than I think it was when I started my BA, and it almost feels like there's a lot of defensiveness from people when it comes to talking about these difficult issues, and whilst that, I think, does trouble me sometimes, I do think that at the moment we have more time to reflect now, and I find that quite a hopeful thing in terms of thinking about, actually, maybe we can talk about the way that feminist groups and Black theatre use these spaces, use ephemeral forms of knowledge transmission, use alternative ways of telling stories as something that's kind of transgressive. That was a really long point, but yeah, that was all my feelings.
No, really clear and cogent and worth every word. And I was thinking as you were talking, what came to mind was Marcelo Fuentes' work on performance constellations, looking in Latin America at the way in which activists, theater artists, people, the combination of online, offline, those kind of ephemeral bursts of activity, and what happens when we look at it together and learn from previous generations of activists in that way. And yeah, I think that you're right, that again, we're back to the complexity and the nuance of that. We have a question in from Marie Folin. I'm an alumni of NUI Galway and the artistic director of No Ropes Theatre Company. And she's talking about the tension in between sometimes the sort of, I think what I'm taking you to mean here, Marie, is talking about the maybe short outreach projects, like doing a podcast series in the run up to a production that looks at diverse minorities or looks at that production is amplifying those sorts of issues, which sometimes can lead to that being taken up as what she's calling inspirational porn or clickbait. And often that stands in for the sort of diversity or inclusion work that needs to be done on a longer term basis. And then the alternative of, how do we get organization, society to look at and to actually invest more resources in long-term projects that support diverse minorities in gaining access to art making, to audience engagement. And as artists, as scholars, practitioners, people engaged in this work here on this panel, I suppose maybe there has been times where you've been part of a project that then has been taken up as an instance of X, Y, or Z, but then the project funding is gone, goes away. And then those longer term issues about the support of the work we're talking here don't go away. And it can feel kind of schizophrenic or the binary between the short term and the headline and then the long term work. So how do you negotiate that in your own experience? And I suppose, how do we also avoid getting caught in just the binary conversation and recognizing that there's maybe a middle ground that we need to keep in mind as well? And Ciara, as Arts Council, I'm looking at you, really.
I was wondering were you looking at me. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I think I'm certainly very aware of it, and this need for these things to be, embedded in the structures, that it is not, as you say, it is not an outreach project or whatever, or that if it is, that also has a lasting impact. And I think there's something really important about, there was a really brilliant article by a British musician, but he writes about Irish arts. It was on Medium, but he wrote about the Arts Council policy in particular and the impact that is having. And he was really brilliant in talking about the policy is there, the work has been done, but what we're not seeing yet, I have to say, is that being embedded in the companies. And it is something that everybody wants, is that these things are, and it is about empowering artists, that it is no longer about somebody, being asked as a Black artist or as a whatever to do a piece about their race or about race or ethnicity, that these people are allowed to make work in whatever way they want, about whatever they want. And it's so vital. And I really feel that that's vital to the art form. It's not even about inclusivity of people, although it is, but it's about that is how we're going to further the art form. It's for everybody's benefit for that to happen. Yeah, sorry, I can't see.
Nadine,
can I join in? I completely echo everything that Ciara's just said. Yeah, I think the kind of expectation of what particular writers are producing needs to be massively problematized. We can't keep expecting writers of a particular demographic to talk about a particular story, because that is just really limiting. And yeah, we need to have long-term infrastructural change. We need to have more people of colour making the higher up decisions in theatre companies, and more women and more LGBTQI plus people making the actual decisions of what stories we're telling, because otherwise it does feel like you are a diversity quota. Yeah.
And is that you coming in, or is that, yeah, come on in? No, okay.
I mean, yes, and yes. My initial response was trust the artists to know the stories to tell. I mean, we're expert storytellers. So, I feel like a lot of time artists are turned to in an effort of tokenism, right? That splash, that publicity. I think it was in the chat in somebody's question, that clickbait, right? That notion like, we'll be the face, it's going to be great, and diversity, done, right? Rather than trusting the artists to do their work and giving them the support, be it monetary or infrastructural, to create the representations that are of relevance to maybe their social identity group or to economics, because we know what we're doing. We're highly trained specialists in this. And I feel like oftentimes artists are put into the role of serving a political agenda or an institutional agenda, rather than in a way that a scientist wouldn't be asked necessarily by an administrator, are you sure this is how you want to do this thing? So I'll just say that.
And on that, I'm reminded of a comment that Leanne made last week, where she was talking about the work that they had done with Waking the Feminists, and really it being a learning experience about where are the touch points, or who are the stakeholders to speak to in order to push at structures to get wider engagement. And in that work, she talked about the importance of talking to boards and artistic directors and so on. But I'm also wondering about the wider community engagement, the wider public. One of the missions of that Black Theater podcast, and you spoke about it so movingly, Nadia, saying, I'm taking up space on this podcast, talking about the arts, talking about theater history as part of living the story I'm trying to tell as well, of not being a theater specialist, coming into this community. If we want to be, I suppose, pushing forward the agenda as activists, as artists, as thinkers, about bringing and keeping more diverse stories in circulation and in space. If within the theater sector, we're talking about Arts Council policy, we're talking about boards, what about in the wider public? Where are the conversations where what we're talking about could be brought more actively to both people who have power or people who want to get involved in other ways?
No, I would just say exactly. I think this was all coming into this was all brand new to me. This was a world that I had no idea about really, and not a lot of interest in, because it was interest in Black stories, but not a lot of interest in theatre because it felt like a place that I didn't quite belong. So I think exactly. I think you need people who aren't academic, to kind of just spark their ears and for them to kind of be drawn in, to keep that sort of momentum going.
And I think as well, the example Ann spoke about, and I got quite nostalgic, Ann, the link up within US liberal art college curriculums, often around bringing people in from different courses, different areas in the university. If we think about that, about where is drama in secondary school curriculums, what school is it in, where is the podcast going, what kind of link up might a project like the podcast have with something that is not theater related, that could perhaps be about getting the conversation in front of a different audience. These are really exciting possibilities that the work that each of you is doing make possible. I want to go back here to the chat now. In practice, Kira Murphy says to us, are we in danger of allowing the current pandemic to erode some of the progress made on sharing space and inclusivity, because we know that it's highlighting and exacerbating social and structural inequalities? And Mairead Folin has weighed in again, saying certainly in terms of making theater accessible for disabled audiences, that has been an issue. So are we in danger? And I suppose, what can we do about it?
Yeah, sorry. I mean, just to agree, I think we have, it is a real pressing danger, I think, at the moment. And it feels like a really big question, a political question as well, in terms of everything, in terms of, particularly, I suppose I'm thinking immediately in gender terms of the impact this lockdown has had on women, and the even like around issues as basic as childcare, and that's really made it difficult. I'm trying desperately to find something optimistic to say because I think that's important. And possible there is some potential, I think, in the shift we are seeing towards the local. I think, like, I don't know, I feel that COVID has brought some kind of more emphasis on community, on your close community, and on what's happening there. And I wonder if there is some potential there, but it is hard to be optimistic about it right now.
Yeah, I mean, I keep thinking and hoping in terms of, you know, the local, the deep desire that I have heard people express just to be in a space with one another. And you know, so like that thing about theater, right? It's not just what's going on stage, it's that it's happening together we've like committed to one another for 2 hours to just be together and tell a story. And that deep desire, I think, I'm hoping when we return to normal, that we're not returning to all sorts of normals, but rather that singular desire for community and conversation and togetherness is reignited. I share the concern about, in terms of gender, in terms of, particularly in terms of women of color in the US and artists in the US. You know, the statistic came out a week or two ago that, you know, most women left their jobs, whether or not they were partnered or single, for caretaking responsibilities. And it, you know, because of longstanding racial inequities, many of Latino women and Black women in the US lost their jobs because most of them are in service sector industries. Combine that with, you know, commercial theater and the way in which it operates in the US, and our artists have been unemployed for a year, right? So like there's the heartbreak for my actors and production team that, you know, we did this beautiful thing and nobody saw it. I mean, we know how, like, what it did, but we didn't get to reach out to wider audiences, let alone those who make their living at it in a fully capitalized industry in the United States, right? Where there is no government support either. I mean, there's very minimal at the local level, at the state level, and then at the national level in the US for artists. So it's been dire.
And I think it's important to say as well, like I'm sure this is not the first panel like this that everyone has been on. And, you know, the questions about solving these bigger issues is important to name them, to identify them, but it does not fall on the 5 people on the panel. You know, if only it did, maybe things would get further, but to name it and to keep naming it. And I suppose then maybe to take then the possibility of that in a more concrete direction. Again, one of the things that I just have to ask Nadine and Nadia, having taught for many years, theater history nerd, what you have done in terms of the bravery and the scope and the integration of all the moving parts of that podcast, as well as the really just honest and unflinching dialogue around whatever is going on in the news at the time of the podcast and so on. It is so impressive. And I just love to hear more about the backstage process for you both in terms of putting it together, pulling it off, and then being able to sleep at night. Also in the hopes, you know, I think we have a lot of students listening in the spirit of reproduction. If somebody was to try to take on a project like this themselves, what was your experience? Were there moments of fear, and how did you push through?
Thank you so much. But that was a really kind word. Thank you, Charlotte. And I just want to say on the discussion earlier regarding the difficulties that are going on, I completely echo what Ciara and Anne were saying. But yeah, it was a big project doing a podcast. I mean, it's just 2 people, and you've got to kind of write it and record it yourself. It wasn't something that I'd done before. I know Nadia hadn't done it. Thank you for saying it was like a kind of big brave thing to do, because we didn't feel like that at the time. It was more of a kind of, we embarked on it because I was looking through the National Theatre Archive, and there was a document about possible project outcomes for the Black Plays Archive. And a problem with the Black Plays Archive, and that it's continued to kind of have since its inception, is that not a lot of people know about it. And the kind of the point of it initially was to show that there's a Black Theatre Canon, and to make it available to researchers and to playwrights, so that you know, theatres can't use the excuse of saying, well, we didn't know about any of these Black plays, so we didn't put any of them on. And so there was a frustration for me when I was looking in the archive, and I guess one of the documents said, well, maybe a podcast could come about, and then I was sort of interested as to why that hadn't happened. And obviously funding's a big issue, and I was just like, well, sod it, no one else is going to do it, so may as well try and give it a go. And that's kind of been the attitude that we've had since we started it. Obviously it's taken a lot of research, and we've written all the episodes ourselves, but it's pretty much just been an attitude of let's give it a go and see what happens, because if we don't do it, then no one will do it.
Exactly. And I think Nadine always sends me stuff that we've kind of been shouted out on Instagram and stuff, and I always say to her, like, I genuinely forget that it's publicized. Like, to me it's just a conversation with my sister, so I forget that it's out there and people listen to it. So I think that makes it a lot easier. Actually, it does kind of evoke some anger in you when you kind of hear all of these stories, and it feels like we're a bit stagnant in terms of moving forward. But yeah, I think it's important for people to know. I think I certainly didn't know that the Black Plays Archive was a thing, and, you know, shout out to Natasha Bonlam for that, because that's an amazing project. And I didn't know that you can go in and it's a physical place, and so all of that was all new to me as well. And I think that's the kind of passion that invoked in me, that I didn't know about this. So there must be like hundreds of thousands of people that don't know that this is a thing, and these stories are real and they're out there. So I think, yeah, it's a passion, but it's just a conversation with my sister at the end of the day. So that's how it's kind of we're able to be like, okay, that's done now, and then forget that that's out there and people can listen to it.
I also think it's really significant that, so I'm a big fan of Chomhairle Andrews, a Black Studies professor at Birmingham City, and he does this wonderful TED talk about the importance of staying radical in the academy. How do we stay radical in the academy? And he says, well, you have to keep one foot outside of it, which is really, really simple. But he's like, you've got to keep one foot in the communities that you're talking about, that you're dealing with, that you're writing about. And so for me, it was really, really important to have someone involved in creating the podcast and disseminating it that wasn't doing a PhD and that wasn't in the academy, not because the work isn't valuable, but because it needed to have those different perspectives and different voices. And I think, you know, only 2% of academics in the UK are Black, under 1% are women. Like, so there aren't many of us there, but and that speaks to wider structural problems and everything. But so it was really important to me to say, well, when we aren't just speaking to the academy with the podcast, we're trying to speak to everyone, and also to show a lineage of Black work, because when we talk about Black theatre, like I think Paulette Randall, the director, was talking about how we always get referred to, Black creators always get referred to as like, there's a few of us that make it through the parapet, there's a few of us that actually get the work put on. And actually there's a really long history of it, and we have to stop thinking about women's work and Black work and work of marginalised peoples as though it's like a series of like blips. There's a long history of it. So yeah.
That number 587 just sticks, you know. That's, and sorry, Nadia, to cut across here, or Ciara, somebody go.
Sorry, I was just going to say, no, that's fascinating. I love the idea that it is that curiosity and that kind of individual curiosity that allows such a bigger impact, that is so compelling. And I was curious to ask Anne as well about her students in terms of the projects and how how they, because I just think it's an amazing project, and if they are aware of the wider impact or the wider thing, or are they simply engrossed in the play and you know
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think some are more aware than others. So I don't know that I would say definitively. We have, but one thing I can say is that in the shift from, if you move me from the rehearsal room into the classroom, we have made this concentrated shift, and this goes back to the question of, I think it was Patrick's, about tools and dissemination of knowledge and reproduction of knowledge. And we have made a shift to teach not theater history, but theater historiography. And that has had a remarkable, in my opinion, impact on our students, in that they can concentrate in the way our courses are structured really on the histories they want to tell within a specific framework or a specific set of questions or problems, that we spend time learning information literacy and brick and mortar archive and a digital archive, and that's where our focus is concentrated, not on a single narrative, but on the fact that there are multiple narratives, many of which are untold, and here's tools. How do you want to build this narrative? And for me, that has been a game changer in my satisfaction in teaching, because it's all about me and my but has really, I think, perpetuated some skills in students that I have two students who've graduated, one who is in graduate school, and another who is hoping to be a working actor, and they've begun a podcast on feminist and queer performance, and I think there's a lot of murder involved, which is great. So it's those kinds of that kind of work that I get excited about, and thinking about Nadine and Nadia saying, I'm just talking to my sister, but when we were talking about stakeholders earlier, I thought Nadia is a stakeholder we need to be talking to, right? It's about audiences, and it's what stories do audiences not know about? How can we bring them into the fold? And so that's all. I'll be quiet. I'm rambling.
Nobody's rambling, and I just want to notice that everyone keeps saying that they are rambling, and at no point are rambling. So Nadia, your mic is off. Are you going to come in, or was that a legacy mic off?
No, sorry, you can carry on.
I have some further questions and comments on here. So I'm just going to, as Patrick Lonergan says, no ramblers here. So earlier we had a question about this idea, or not the idea, or how you position what Black theater is within the podcast, which is a question that has come back to again and again with artists over the course of the time. So I'm going to join that question with, also we have Alda Terracciano, and I apologize if that was incorrect pronunciation, Alda, who has come to say she's the co-founder of Future Histories, the first independent archive of Black and Asian theater in the UK, who are celebrating their 20th anniversary this year. And she would love to hear, maybe later, about what they should highlight from the collection, and also an invitation to collaborate in designing the program. So I suppose then, maybe even in reference to that as well, this question of, okay, what is Black theater? And then if we were to think about Black and Asian theater and Black British Asian theater together, what are some things that need highlighting? I'm just going to then bookmark that we have a question about minority language practice in theater that I'll come back to again, because we have about 3 minutes left. But what is Black theater? How do you keep wrestling with that? What should we be highlighting if we think about the 20th anniversary of Black and Asian theater?
That's a massive question. So thank you. First off, thank you, Elder. That's it's so lovely. Let's chat, and link up and talk about the programme. That sounds amazing. The BPA does connect and directs people to Future Histories archive. It's an amazing archive. I think there's some work by Sue Andy in there. I might be mistaken, but I'd really like, you know, not a lot of people know about Sue Andy, who's this incredible kind of live artist, poet, playwright, who's amazing. That I think she's in the Future Histories archive. I might be wrong, but you know, give me some time to think, and I'll come back to you. When it comes to kind of defining what Black theatre is, I get asked this quite a lot, and I find it quite a difficult question to answer. So I'll go with what the BPA defines it is first, and then I'll try and answer kind of what my own feelings on it are. But so the BPA defines Black theatre as any play, any theatre that is written by someone who identifies as Black. But it specifically talks about Black in the terms of the African and African Caribbean diaspora. It doesn't include people who are of Asian descent, so it isn't kind of political Blackness from kind of in line with the definition from the 70s and 80s. It's very much more to do with people of the African diaspora, of African descent. So that's what the BPA defines it as. My feelings on what Black theatre is I think I sometimes get told that Black theatre is theatre that it has a Black cast, a Black director, a Black playwright, a Black designer, and well, there would be very few plays that get staged in Britain that would class as Black theatre if that's the only way you define Black theatre. I guess for me, Black theatre is generally written by a Black playwright that is talking about issues that affect Black people, but not only that. So not only, like, I don't think it's only a play that talks about issues that affect Black people, but it's talking about Black stories, and there's a myriad. So that doesn't mean just talking about you know, drug trafficking in the end or whatever. There's a myriad stories. But having said that, like, there are stories that are talking about, I guess, Black culture and Black stories in theatre, but are directed and designed and produced by white creative teams, and those are more problematic to me. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that I don't think it's a clear-cut thing of what Black theatre is. I think one of the main kind of key points that I do think it needs to have is that it needs to be written by a Black person, because they're shaping the story, and it's dealing with kind of things that affect Black people, which are a myriad number of things. Like, there are Black plays about, you know, just random things that you wouldn't see in the mainstream that are seen as Black, but they're still Black theatre. I think I've said too much, but yeah, I hope that's answered the question.
Incredibly rigorous and layered, and, you know, a lot to think about. And indeed, that is what every guest on the podcast as well seems to be reckoning with, or that you speak about in some way. And so dive deeper in, Claire and others, to hear how it plays out over decades and artists. So we had a contribution here from, and I know that we're at 4:30, but we'll just take a moment to talk about this question and for me to just voice it, and then for us to close out here. So Marianne Kennedy is a lecturer here at NUI Galway in drama, and also an Irish language theatre maker, runs the collective Garian Giria. So she's talking here about the specific issue of Irish language arts policy within Ireland, as we are theoretically a bilingual nation in principle, but not necessarily in practice, particularly in arts policy. So she's talking about Indigenous minority language exists in the canon of teaching within universities. And I think here with this international panel as well, there are different kinds of Indigenous issues around indigeneity in the US, in the UK, in terms of colonial histories, and then within Ireland, the question about arts policy, diversity, and where language sits in there. So I suppose maybe the way that I would take Marianne's observation and question here, and pose it to all of you, is how how you have seen or think work around minority languages, indigeneity fits into the kind of work that you're doing, or any thoughts about language, indigeneity, and pushing boundaries through the innovative projects and ideas here.
I think something that me and Nadine touch on is throughout the podcast is language as well. We talk about this particular episode where we're talking about patois, and when we're talking about it, I think I can't remember in what context it was, but I think it's important that we get across the message that patois is not a colloquial slang. I think a lot of people throw around the language like it's like roadman talk, and it's not. It's an actual language, it's a legitimate language, and it should be recognised as such. Yeah, that's all I really wanted to say.
Yeah, I think I'm sorry, I'm just going to elaborate on what Nadia was talking about. We were kind of we were talking about, there were a few plays we were talking about the work of Mustafa Matura from the 70s, and Natasha Gordon's play Nine Night, and yeah, like I think in terms of nation language and kind of dialects like patois that are spoken on stage in and kind of are still, I think, kind of radical in the sense that there's still a lot of audience members who I'm not going to name any names, but there are certain audience members that I've seen where you go to a play and then that has patois in it, and then there'll be kind of some white middle class members of the audience who will walk out of the play saying, "What were they talking about? Couldn't they have had subtitles?" And so yeah, I think it's really, really important to kind of get across that the different dialects and the different languages used in the Black community like are legitimate and should be kind of valued. I was reading an essay by Roseanne Chantaluque the other day about education and decolonizing education, and this idea that teachers, she's a teacher, and the other teachers have come up to her saying, "We need to get the Black students to speak proper. They're not speaking properly," and they were just speaking how they speak on the street, but that isn't valued in the classroom. And so yeah, I think it's just important to understand there are different ways of kind of communicating, and that they need to be put on as big a platform as possible.
I think the issue in the U.S. is quite similar to what you're describing in terms of the use predominantly in bilingual or multilingual productions, or bilingual productions in terms of the use of the Spanish language, a real resistance to that from mainstream white audiences, and also in terms of the respect for and recognition of Black vernacular as language, as legitimate language. So, and in terms of Indigenous languages and recognition of Indigenous cultures, I think part of the issue in the United States is the siloing of that into sort of ethnic studies programs or Native studies programs in a way that draws boundaries and borders between Western theatrical conventions and Native American or Indigenous theatrical conventions. I'll leave it there.
Thanks. It's really helpful. And I think, on that, I think, again, what is in common, I'm going to come back to that quote of Nadine's from the beginning, how does information grow? And I think that all four of you have shown us, yes, the questions and the work that we're talking about is ongoing. It is layered. It is about the structural and not just what individual artists can do, or even individual artists working with it, or people working within policy. But to keep accumulating the small acts, telling the story anyway, using these tools to tell stories, which may be devalued or seem to be more kind of, who maybe devalued it, and that is a pushing against what is the document of the blog or the podcast, or indeed this conversation. And so to have the courage to keep doing the work, but also recognizing when our energy is perhaps at an ebb. And maybe that is now, because we are 10 minutes over time. But thank you so much. It has been a real privilege to be in conversation with all of you, and a joy to actually get to make this happen under the COVID conditions. Thank you to Patrick and Ciara. Also shout out again to Alda Terrachiano, who talks to us about the Trading Faces Archive, which is looking at the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade in British performing arts, and that's now being redeveloped. Many stories to tell, to keep telling. I look forward to what you all do next, and indeed what our audience may be inspired to do after today. Thanks so much.